Well, good morning, folks. I'm Maria Bowie, and we appreciate everyone taking time to join us today for our extension webinar. This is my first time hosting, so I appreciate your patience as I get used to this new role. Today we have three exceptional specialists that are going to be sharing with us with their expertise in helping folks prepare for hurricane season. Pam Knox currently serves as director of the UGA Weather Network and agricultural climatologist with Cooperative Extension. Pam has experience conducting scientific research on weather and climate-related topics and works with data from several weather networks, including the National Weather Service. Tim Davis currently serves as our Chatham County Extension Coordinator and Ag and Natural Resources Agent and is the director of the Coastal Georgia Botanical Garden. Tim has extensive experience serving as a key personnel on site during severe weather events, serving in the Chatham County Emergency Operations Center. And Diane Bell serves as our Extension Human Development Specialist and also directs the Child Life Program with the UGA College of Family and Consumer Sciences. Diane teaches those who work with children, adolescents, and families how to support a healthy development. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Pam and let her take it away.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to do my video open for just a minute. My husband's on a Zoom call too, so I'm going to turn it off. I'm sure more than one of you can probably relate to that, but I'll try to turn it on back in again at the end. I'm Pam Knox. I've been the director of the UGA Weather Network for the last couple of years since Ian Flitcroft retired. And before that, I've spent many years in Georgia as the assistant state climatologist and as an agricultural climatologist. What I'm going to talk to you today is mostly about the meteorological aspects of tornadoes and hurricanes. Well, not tornadoes, hurricanes and tropical storms. If you want to go on to the next slide, this is just some contact information. I do have another slide at the end with more contact information. If you're interested in seeing the Weather Network, you can go to weather.uga.edu, and we've got 86 stations around the state that collect weather information. So let's go on and start out by talking about some basic facts about hurricanes and tropical storms. Generally, the tropical storm will start as a wave of low pressure that comes off of Africa and moves towards the west. You can kind of see that in the diagram here, life cycle of the hurricane. Right now, we have one of those waves out in the central Atlantic Ocean. It's expected to turn into Tropical Storm Josephine today. It's not going to hit us. It's going to curve before it gets to land, and that's going to be a pretty weak system, so it's nothing for us to worry about. Late in the season, they actually tend to start in the Gulf of Mexico and along the east coast of the U.S., but this time of year during peak hurricane season, they usually form as these waves that come off of Africa. And you have to have pretty warm ocean temperatures for hurricanes to form. It usually has to be at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Not a problem this time of year, of course, and sea surface temperatures have been quite high. But if the temperature happens to be colder than that, you don't get too many hurricanes. And that's why it's really hard to get hurricanes in the South Atlantic, south of the equator. Also, if you have really strong winds aloft, a strong jet stream, that tends to blow the storms apart before they can develop. And so that's some of the things that meteorologists look for. Here's a climatology of the storms as they go through the year. And you can see that the number of hurricanes in yellow there and hurricanes and tropical storms increases to a peak right around September 10. Right now, today is August 13, so we're just entering the peak of the season. And it's unusual this year because we're already talking about our J storm. Some years we don't even get to J, but we still have most of the season to go. So this is a very active year. And you can really expect to see things start to ramp up in the next couple of weeks as we enter this really peak time with the warmest ocean temperatures and the weakest jet streams aloft. You can have damage from tropical storms and hurricanes from a number of different things. If you're along the coast, storm surge is important. We have not seen too many storms like that in Georgia lately because the only storms that really have affected us lately are hurricanes like Michael, which came from the Gulf Coast. And of course, we don't have coastal area along the Gulf Coast there. But in the 1800s, there were quite a few storms that came on shore in Georgia on the Atlantic coast, and they had a lot of problems with storm surge then. So that's something we'll have to keep watching for because we don't know where the next storm is going to come from. High winds, of course, are a big issue for a lot of the storms, and that was a big issue for Hurricane Michael. You can get tornadoes. They usually are pretty small tornadoes, but they can happen a long way from the center of the storm. When Hurricane Ivan came on shore in, I think that was 2004, we actually had a related tornado in Athens here. So that's a long ways away, but it can happen way out ahead of the storm. And also heavy rain, which has been an issue for a lot of the storms lately, like Florence and Matthew and Harvey in Texas. We use a rule of thumb in meteorology that the rainfall that you can expect of a storm is 100 divided by the forward speed in miles per hour. So if you have a hurricane that's moving pretty fast at maybe 10 miles an hour, then 100 divided by 10 means you'll get about 10 inches of rain. But if you have a slow storm like Hurricane Florence, it's only moving about 3 miles an hour. 100 divided by 3 means you can expect to get about 33 inches of rain in all from that storm. It's a pretty rough way of doing it, but I think pretty effective at sort of feeling what you're going to be up against. I'm going to kind of break what you do as far as getting ready for tropical season into 3 things, sort of the ready, set, go method. Here we're talking about getting ready for the tropical season way ahead of time. So this would probably be in the spring before we even enter the official tropical season on June 1. Of course, we can get storms in May, but they're usually pretty small. So the first thing is you need to figure out where you're going to get your information on weather and evacuation. I know Tim's going to talk more about evacuation as well. You want to use reputable sources like the National Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service. Apps that you use on your phone are usually not a good way to get information about tropical weather. They're fine for getting daily forecasts, but they don't really do very well in rapidly changing conditions, unless you get one that's specifically designed by FEMA or something to provide you with that kind of information. The other thing you need to do is take a look at your property. You need to look at your buildings to see if they're going to be safe from wind damage. Trees are another thing. Dr. Coder of the Forestry School reminded me that you really need to assess your trees ahead of time to make sure you don't have any weak branches or branches that could fall and affect your tree. Or, if they're pulling out of the ground, then you want to get those taken care of well before you have any impacts of the hurricane winds or even tropical storm winds. So those are things to look for. You need to identify sources of power. For example, if you're running a dairy and you need to milk your dairy cattle, you need to be able to figure out how are you going to power that if you lose your electricity, which can certainly happen in a tropical storm or hurricane. You need to assess if your insurance is adequate. Flood insurance is something that most people probably should have, but you have to have it purchased at least 30 days ahead of the first claim. And so you can't buy it the day before a hurricane hits. It doesn't work that way. You also need to make a plan for your family and your business. And this would certainly include extension offices. How are you going to contact each other if you have to evacuate? Who's going to be in charge of making sure that the office is safe, especially these days when a lot of people are not in the office. What power needs you might have. Do you have backups for your computers? Where to shelter if a tornado happens to come and you're in the office, where to go if you don't have time to get home or something like that. It's important to back up important records. This is true for both families and businesses. You need to store them somewhere safe. Don't wait till the last minute to do that, because if the power goes off unexpectedly ahead of time, then you're really stuck. And as Dr. Coder said to me, it's better to do prep work than storm cleanup. So everything you can do ahead of the season is going to benefit you in the long run. So that's the ready. Now, getting set means the hurricane season has started. Where do you go to look for information on where that begins? The National Hurricane Center puts out daily tropical weather outlooks for 2 and 5 days. This was one from, I think what became Isaias is that little yellow X there. But this is fairly early in the season right now. There's a circle there for Tropical Depression 11 today, which should turn into Josephine later today. We'll give you a clue as to where, if there's anything that they're watching and where it's likely to go. For local forecasts, you can go to the National Weather Service. This particular diagram here is the hourly temperature and wind prediction that I like to use just to see what's going to happen locally, but there's plenty of other formats if you like text format instead. And you can also access a variety of different outlooks and forecasts for tropical weather. Seasonal forecasts just tell you how many tropical storms and hurricanes you expect to see in a season. And NOAA just updated theirs to just an unprecedented number of storms this year. The conditions are just perfect for the development of tropical storms and hurricanes, even though we've already had 10 this year, or we will have had 10 if Josephine occurs today. We could get another 10 or even 15. And not all of those, of course, will hit the Southeast, but chances are that at least some of them will. And so we know this is going to be an active year. That means that it's even more important for you to get ready ahead of time. And now is a perfect time while things are relatively quiet to go out and do those assessments if you haven't done them already. Looking 2 weeks ahead, there's something that's called the Global Tropical Hazards. It's on the Climate Prediction Center website. I've got the link there. You can go back later and look at it. And all this will be available later as a recording, I think, as well. And so you'll be able to go back and look at this. And then the 5-day outlooks that I showed earlier, which shows what it's likely to happen in the next 2 to 5 days. I did want to mention something about what we like to call in meteorology as spaghetti models. You've probably heard this. There's even a website called spaghettymodels.com. When forecasters try to come up with a forecast for where a hurricane's going to go, they look at a lot of different computer models, the same way that they do when they're looking at weather forecasts. Each of those forecasts has just a little bit different characteristics, and they put out what they think is going to be the best path of the hurricane based on their assessment. And then spaghetti models are when you kind of plot them all together on one map. And the map that I have shown here right now is for Hurricane Irma of a couple of years ago. And you can see that a lot of those forecast models concentrate the path of Hurricane Irma, where actually Irma did go. But of course, you know, even small differences in that path can make a big difference to local impacts. So it's important to realize that these are just guesses. We don't know which one's going to be the best anytime. No one model is perfect, and no one model is better all the time. And so you really need to leave it to the official forecasters to try to judge which of those is working the best in a particular situation. But there's if you'll go back just a minute, there's a link on there. It's kind of small, but the University of Miami just put out a nice article which describes when they're good and when they're not good, which you might find interesting. Let's go back on. Okay, so now the storm is on the way. You've seen that, you know, the weather reports are starting to talk more about the hurricane or the tropical storm that might be coming. And so what do? The important things that you're going to need to know are the timing. When is it going to come? Because that's going to tell you how soon you have to take actions. How strong it's going to be. If it's a weak storm, you might be able to ride it out. If it's a really strong storm, you probably don't want to. And the emergency managers are going to know that and will tell you what to do. And confidence. How sure are you that it's going to hit where you are as opposed to going in a different direction? Okay, so this forecast, which is from the National Hurricane Center, shows what they call the forecast cone. And that cone shows the most likely area that a storm will go. Now you have to keep in mind it could go anywhere within that cone, and the impact certainly could spread far outside the cone as well. So the wider the cone is, the less confidence we have, and you can use that forecast also to determine the timing and the strength. You'll get the little black dot in the middle there. This is the forecast for Isaias, what became Isaias, and this is what prompted me to put out my first email. I'm the person who sends out the annoying emails about tropical storms coming towards Georgia, to warn you that it looks like Georgia is now entering the cone, and we need to really ramp up our awareness of that. So you can see in the little black dot there, it says S. That means they were predicting it was going to be a tropical storm during that time. And that was a perfectly good forecast. It did turn into a hurricane for a little while over water. And then as it came on shore in the Carolinas, it also became a hurricane again just before it went on shore. So you can use that as a general guideline, but in the case of Isaias, the path stayed just off the coast of Florida. And so it was still in the cone, but it was not in the center of the cone. It's important not to focus too much on the center of that cone. So the next thing to figure out is, what is your plan? What are you going to do? And how much notice do you need to do it to prepare for a hurricane or a tropical storm coming towards you? I put this little example here in black in the left. My son's girlfriend got this from her boss in North Carolina. She works in Durham. And they actually had a plan written out that they emailed to all their employees about what they needed to do ahead of time. And this is a great idea because everybody had an idea of, making sure they had things backed up, making sure that somebody had contact information for them, and so on. You need to have a plan ahead of time, what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, who's in charge of it, like who's going to be the one that's backing up your office computers, the timeline for when you're going to take those different actions, how to communicate. You probably should all have each other's cell phones so that you can keep in contact with each other if you need to later. Where you need to go if you're going to evacuate, because you might have to evacuate and you don't want to have to decide at the last minute. You need to know ahead of time. And what to do if you can't leave. And sometimes that's going to happen. A written plan is certainly the best. And if you can practice it, even better. Okay, so what happens if you can't get out? Living through the storm. If you're given a notice from your emergency manager, and I think Tim's going to talk about this more too, you need to evacuate. Don't try to outguess them. And if you need to evacuate with pets, then that should be part of your plan too. If you need to evacuate, don't wait till the last minute because the roads could get clogged up. They could run out of gas. You want to make sure you leave in plenty of time so that you can get away from the area that's going to be affected. If you are staying, make sure you find a safe place inside your house. And that will help you figure out where you can go that would be safely. Make sure you have enough food and water for a week because you might not be able to get out, and you need to charge up all your electronic equipment. And I'll tell you, it's not going to be a fun experience because you could be living through 6 hours or more of screaming winds, which is going to be very hard on your family and especially on your kids. And Diane's going to talk more about that later today. Go on to the next slide. After the storm passes, the first thing you need to do is make sure your family is safe. That's always the first thing you should make sure of. You could experience power out for a week or more. This picture is from after Hurricane Michael came on shore in Mexico Beach, Florida. Imagine waking up to see that, and how are you going to deal with that? The roads could be blocked for a long time. They could be blocked just from sand or trees, or debris of various sorts. Another thing to keep in mind is you cannot wait, once you're sure their family's safe, don't wait for emergency responders to come in and help your neighbors because they might not be able to get in either. And so as long as you feel like you're all safe, it's fine to go and see what's going on in your neighborhood and help other people out. Extension is very strong on helping each other. And so keep that in mind. You should be able to do that. And then just some safety tips: treat power lines as live unless you know otherwise. Be careful with chainsaws and other power equipment. And the reason for that is people die in recovering from these storms too, because they're not being careful about these kind of equipment and issues that could come up. Let's go on. I just have a couple of resources here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tim in a minute or two. There's a brand new handbook called the Georgia Residents Handbook to Prepare for Natural Hazards. It's not out on the web yet. It's supposed to be out soon. I'll post it on my blog when it is, or you can search for it as well. It's from UGA's Marine Extension. GEMA also has a really good Georgia hurricane guide. And of course, Extension has a lot of different publications that are geared towards specific industries like livestock or cotton or so on that you might find useful. I guess the website's on the very bottom there. It's kind of cut off on my picture. Go ahead. And then I'm gonna end here and just say, if you need to contact me, here's all my information. I'm actually at home today because my webcam at work is not functioning properly. I do have a blog at the Extension blog site under climate. I post almost every day on different things, and I'm trying to be more active when we have tropical activity that looks like it's going to affect Georgia. And you can follow me on Facebook or on Twitter as well, so you can see updated information that way. I do also send out emails to Extension when I think there's something that they need to think ahead about, but it doesn't always work on the weekends, and so follow me those other ways as well. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tim, and he's going to talk more about local preparation.
All right, good morning, everyone. They did ask me to talk about some of this local stuff. My name's Tim Davis. I'm the Chatham A&R agent. I'm also the CEC. I'm the director of the Georgia Coastal Botanical Garden, and also the interim CEC in McIntosh. So wear quite a few hats. Next slide. I do want to thank some folks. You know, there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes when you do one of these. So you got Polly and David there, and Maria's done a great job of helping us kind of pull all this stuff together. So I want to thank all of them for this. I am not an expert in this. I just really am not. But I do have a good bit of experience. I started really kind of some of this stuff in 1989 when Hugo went through Charleston, and a group of my friends and I, we went down to Charleston and helped people remove trees. We were there a little bit, maybe 24 hours after the storm. And then as an extension agent, the first one that I really remember was Hurricane Floyd. Floyd was supposed to hit Florida, and then it made a turn at the last minute. And so Florida was evacuating, then Georgia started to evacuate, and then South Carolina started to evacuate. And all of a sudden they had 3.5 million people on the road, and traffic came to a standstill. And we learned a lot about evacuation during that. I learned a lot about what extension does during that. I was in the Richland County Extension office in South Carolina, and the phone was ringing off the hook because it kept saying, for more information, call your county extension agent. And I had no idea what to tell anybody. But a friend of mine, it normally takes 2 hours to get from Charleston to Columbia, and he was on the road for 19 hours. And people were running out of gas right alongside the road. They couldn't find bathrooms or shelter or motel rooms. I mean, it was a huge mess. And so we learned a lot about evacuation during that. And then I've been involved with an organized response. I was part of the state emergency operations in South Carolina, and I put this graphic up here because this is Hurricane Joaquin. And if you look at, you heard her talking about the pathways that they take and the predictions, and Joaquin was way off the shore, and none of us were really responding to it. And all of a sudden we got this weird kind of weather thing, and it sucked moisture from Joaquin right up into South Carolina. And that's what the top graphic shows. And it looked like it was targeting South Carolina itself. And we got, in Columbia, I got about 13, 14 inches of rain in about 6 or 8 hours. And I got called, and this is where that part about when you least expect it. I got a phone call to come to the Emergency Operations Center. Thought I was going to be there for about 3 or 4 hours. And I ended up there for the next 72 without leaving. So you always have to be ready. And, whatever expectation you have, it may not always get that way. I also put in there, we always forget, and we do. From one event to the other, we always forget everything that we learned from the last one a lot of times. And so just, think back on the storms and what you went through. So, when they call for that evacuation, go ahead and get out of there. And, you have an event like Dorian, where it was a really bad hurricane, but it was 15 miles further out than we expected, and so we had almost no impacts. If it had been 15 miles further inland, we would have had a pretty rough time. But everybody evacuated, and then it was kind of like nothing. So the next evacuation happens, people say, We don't need to do that. So we do forget every time. I also tell people, you know, one of my experiences is that we should prepare. We don't plan, we prepare. And what that means is, you know, I have a plan and things don't always go that way. I plan to go out in the woods today and take a little walk. I plan to be back for supper. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and I'm prepared to spend the night if I have to and be very comfortable. I always tell people slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And that means that if you have all these things in place, you don't have to panic. You can take your time and let this thing happen in slow motion. And that's one of the nice things about, one of the few nice things about a tropical storm, whether it's a storm or a hurricane. It's a slow motion event. You know, it's not like an earthquake where in the middle of the night, bad things happen and you never really had a chance. This, we usually have 7 to 10 days to kind of pull it all together. Next slide. In 2016, I took a position here in Chatham County. That's Savannah, for those of you who aren't familiar with all the counties in like me in Georgia. And since that time, we've experienced Tropical Storm Hermine, Matthew, Hurricane Irma, Dorian, Michael, and one pretty serious storm event. And I had a graphic on here and Maria took it out, but you know, I'm just pointing out this is correlation, not cause. It is not my fault. But it is important to realize that we do experience this. A lot of people think the Georgia Bight, which is that area where, you know, you got Florida down here, sticks out, and South Carolina, North Carolina sticks out, and we're kind of a little bit further west, and that's going to save us. That's not true. And thinking that we haven't had any events, you know, that's not true either. Next slide. Top graphic up there, I put that in there because that's Michael. Michael formed very quickly in the Gulf and moved through the Panhandle, but my main reason for putting that up there is to remind everyone, tropical storms are not something that just happens to us on the coast. In fact, Michael, when it went through, you know, had devastating effects on obviously southeast Georgia or southwest Georgia, but middle Georgia had a lot of impact from it as well. So nobody is safe from it. And this year we got a little bit different situation. You know, we've got COVID out there. So disaster and disease, I say, you know, all through history, you know, if you've had medical entomology or if you've had microbiology or, you know, parasitology, a lot of different things like that, you know that the disaster and disease go together. But we really haven't had to deal with something like this in modern history. So what are the things you're going to be dealing with? You know, any of these storms, you're going to have a lot of flooding. In fact, most of the things I see when I'm sitting in the Emergency Operations Center deal with the flooding. Most of the things I see afterwards where somebody's injured or died has been from flooding. We have power outages. These can happen anytime during the storm, and it may be days, weeks, or even months sometimes before power can be restored in the most devastating things. We see a lot of CO2 poisoning where people are out of power and they run a generator and end up having CO2 problems. Down power lines, which is a little bit different than the power outages. So, you know, after Matthew, I was going downtown. At that time, our office was downtown, and I'm walking along, and there were electrical power lines just laying along the sidewalks. You know, so that's an issue. Safe food, safe water. I would say probably the #1 phone call we get in the office after an event is power's out, refrigerator and freezer went down. Is this food safe? Safe water is an issue. Even if you have city water, things like that, it has happened since I've been here that the city water supply has been inundated and has to be purged and cleaned. And so tap water isn't even safe. So you need to be prepared for that. We've had problems where the wastewater plant has been inundated. And so even that ability to deal with waste is an issue. Water damage from flooding, leaking is an issue. Debris is an issue, whether it's the trees that come down or maybe your neighbor's boat landed in your front yard. I've seen all those things happen and a few others. But this year we also have to consider about COVID hygiene. Anything that we do is going to have to deal with that. The physical and social distancing that has to happen. So as you're evacuating, we're going to have to take that into account, and the things that we do in our offices, the things that we do at home, the places that we go, we're going to have to think about that. I got COVID isolation in there. You know, if you're going somewhere and somebody's sick, you get COVID. The place that you're going, the family there gets COVID. You have to have a place that you can separate those things. Somebody can be isolated, somebody can be quarantined. And then the last thing I put on here, I always include emotional health. These events are traumatic. And I know I've experienced it at times, and you don't know that that's what's happening to you. But you're stressed, your adrenaline's rolling, you're working a lot of hours, you're working hard, you're worrying about your family, you're worrying about your home, you're worrying about your work and your employees. Just a lot of opportunity there for emotional health issues. So you're going to really have to take that into account. Next slide. So what do we need to think about? With tropical storms and COVID, shelters are going to have a reduced capacity. So if that place had room for 100 people, we're going to have room for 20. And so, if you're thinking about evacuating to a shelter, that place is going to fill up really, really fast. So you need to think about that. Transportation, a lot of times one of the things I do in the EOC is logistics. And so we have to order buses for transportation. Well, we used to be able to say, okay, we're going to put 40 people in this bus. Now we can put 10 or 15 in that bus. So our ability to transport people from our community to a shelter or to someplace else is going to be greatly reduced. Special needs transportation. So if somebody's in assisted living, they have contracts to move those people out. But all of a sudden now, because of that reduced capacity, they don't have the capacity to move those people out. So we need to think about that sooner. If you have family members who are in assisted living, you probably need to go back and look and see if you can help them evacuate. Remember, some of those people in assisted living have not had contact. They've been kind of confined to quarters for months. So it's not going to be as simple as people think. When you're in those shelters, when you're in those places that you're evacuating to Uncle Schmedley's house, you're going to have to consider social distancing. You're coming to this place. They could have issues with COVID. You could have it, so, it'd be nice to have a house that has this part for you and this part for them. And you need to be able to think about that. Again, quarantine or isolation. If somebody gets sick, do we have a place we can isolate them, push them to the side, and let them deal with that and not spread it around? When COVID hit, emergency supplies became very, very limited. Everybody talks about toilet paper, and that's a big deal. Those supplies are already limited. When a hurricane comes along, the shelves empty out very, very quickly, and the shelves are already empty. So you need to be thinking very far ahead, get everything you need so that when that storm forms out there and everybody has that panic, you can sit back and watch and be very calm and cool because you're ready to roll. And if you don't need it, that's wonderful. If you do need it, you're ready to rock and roll with it. I think the other problem that we're going to run into is not only do we have limited supply, but our ability to resupply is going to be heavily impacted. So again, not just having what you need for what you normally do, but I think you're going to need to have stuff for a longer period of time. And then childcare in schools is always a problem. We have no idea what our schools are doing half the time now with COVID. Think about when there's a storm and what that means. And you're trying to work and you have to work and your employer is requiring you to be there, but then the school's let out and you got this child at home. And so you're having to make all these adjustments and you maybe not be able to have your neighbor come over like you used to. So you may need to really think about that. What are we going to do under COVID with our childcare? Next slide. So here's some recommendations and extension. We're always making recommendations for various things, pesticides or whatever, but so here's my recommendations for COVID. Develop your plans early. You don't have room to improvise this year. And it's plans plural, so have more than one option, You may be planning to go to Uncle Schmedley's house, but Uncle Schmedley maybe doesn't want you there this year. Or you may be on your way to Uncle Schmedley's house and he calls and says, hey, you know what? I just got tested positive for COVID and you're going to have to go somewhere else. So you need a plan B, plan B, C, a plan D. The more plans you have, the better off you're going to be. Everything you're going to do, you're going to have to think about COVID. I think you need to think about evacuating sooner. I think you need to think about evacuating further. One of the things we do is we say, okay, if I go this far, we draw a circle. If I go this far, I'm safe. And we go across that line and we stop. And that puts pressure, and everybody does that. So that puts pressure on those local resources wherever that line is. So go further than that so that you'll have whatever supplies you need. And I think you need to evacuate longer. It's going to take us longer to respond and for emergency responders. So plan on being away. So, I'll put that picture up there. If you've got the Corn Palace in Mitchell, South Dakota on your bucket list, that might be a good time to go visit the Corn Palace. I think you need extra supplies. We always say 3 days, or we say a week. I think you need probably longer than that this year. If you are staying, which is usually a bad decision, you need to be prepared for a longer recovery, a longer response. And so you're going to have to be sitting there on your own longer. And just understand, if you stay, I'll tell you what it's like from sitting in the EOC. When the wind speeds get up to 35 miles an hour, they no longer send out ambulances or fire trucks or police. So if you're out there and there's a fire in your house because you were burning candles and the wind speed's over 35 miles an hour, you're going to sit there and wait and watch your house burn while you stand outside in that storm. So that's a very, very big reason why I have people tell people all the time, you need to evacuate. I have responsibility, so I evacuate my family so that I don't have to worry about what's happening at home or worry about what's happening with my family. And the other one that I see all the time is there's a lot of injuries that happen because after the storm, we want to drive around and we want to get pictures of that creek, that river, the trees blown down. Don't do that. I see more and more people get injured doing that. Next slide. You need to think about all the regular supplies that we talk about: food, water, medicine, first aid. Not only just have first aid, but know how to use your first aid. We need to think about power. Get your batteries charged, get all the batteries you need. It's kind of silly, but a lot of people, we end up sitting in our cars, running, trying to charge our phones. Make sure you have all your personal supplies. A big one is important documents. Pam talked about that a good bit. A couple things I see people miss is you need proof of residency. So in order to get back, they're gonna have people standing there saying you can't come in unless you're a resident, and you're gonna have to show paperwork, and that's usually a power bill or something like that. You need to be thinking about your child care. Transportation, keep your gas tank full. When Dorian came through last year, there was no gas to be found anywhere in Chatham County. I live in Effingham, which is the next county in. There was no gas there to be found. Keep your vehicle everyday carry. That's what VEDC is. So I keep everything I need to work with my my vehicle or whatever. One big one we see all the time is people forget about their pets. You love your pet, but when you need to evacuate, Uncle Schmedley says, no, you can't bring your pet because I got a cat, and your dog wants to kill cats. And then they want to take them to a shelter here, and there just isn't the capacity. So really be thinking about that. Anybody that has special needs, make sure you have everything that they need. If they need oxygen, if they, we get calls, hey, we're in the middle of a storm. My mom is here and she's on oxygen. She's about to run out of oxygen. And not only can we not get to them, but we don't necessarily have enough of that to go around. So make sure you have all of that. Pam mentioned communication. Once things start going, a lot of times, people aren't reading email at home, or internet goes down. So your cell phones are pretty good. So make sure you have the ability to text everybody, and texting is better than calling. So because it takes less bandwidth. For your home, make sure you're covering your windows, turn off your power, turn off your gas, turn off your water. Make sure you have CO2 detection, particularly if you're home. And a lot of this is on website. So next slide. And that's why I'm moving pretty fast. I'm really hoping that what I do is cause you to think about it. I'm not teaching you everything you need to know, but really wanting you to stop and think about it. The best single source, I think, for everybody locally is your local emergency management agency. They have websites, they have social media, they have call centers. You can call them. If you're looking at setting up a continuity of operations plan for your business, they'll help you with that. I put the Chatham emergency up there because they have a good one. They're recognized as one of the best in the country. So, I put that one up there. UGA extension, if you just do a Google search or any kind of search on UGA extension and hurricanes, we've put together and compiled a lot of good information. Elizabeth and I think a couple others have done a really good job of compiling that. National Weather Service is one of my primary sources for information as far as the storms go. The CDC has a really good, pretty decent site on sheltering and COVID and hurricane preparedness and marrying those up. So again, if you do a search and say COVID and hurricane, this site comes up. Next slide. Ready.gov is a really good site on how to get those plans together, those preps together. What, they have a list of things that you ought to have in your everyday carry. Pam mentioned the Georgia Residence Handbook, which will be released soon. This was something done by Marine Extension, but a lot of our extension specialists had a hand in writing it and editing it, so that's a pretty good one. Last site I added on here was a certified arborist. I really, 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 really recommend that people do not handle their own tree work. It's very, very dangerous work. And I know I can list at least 10 people that I know personally who have been killed doing chainsaw work or tree work. So it's very, very dangerous. Probably the saddest one I know is Ellen Bowski does a class on chainsaw safety. She did some training in South Carolina, and one of the agents there did a training on chainsaw safety. And the next day, her dad had a chainsaw accident and was killed. So don't do that. This site will let you find arborists. And what I do is right before a storm, I'll go in there and it says, search for an arborist, and I say 100-mile radius or a 200-mile radius, and I print all those out and I take them to the EOC with me so that we can say, here's all the arborists that you can contact. Next slide. And that's my contact information. I strongly recommend, if you want to get a hold of me, email me, because I have at least 3 offices that I run around and I never actually know which one I'm going to be in. So emailing is usually the best way to get a hold of me. And with that, I'll turn it over to Diane.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I appreciate it. I'm Diane Bales. I am Human Development Specialist in the Department of Human Development and Family Science in the College of Family and Consumer Sciences. And I am going to talk about how do you help children cope with and prepare for and cope with a hurricane.
Diane, you're muted.
I apologize. Let me start again. I am Diane Bales. I am a human development specialist with the College of Family and Consumer Sciences, and I'm going to talk about preparing children for emergencies and helping children cope. Some of the purposes of preparing children for emergencies. The first and foremost one is to reduce the risk of harm or injury. Obviously, we want to keep adults safe. We want to keep children and teens safe as well. Preparing children also helps, though, to reduce fear, anxiety, and panic, all of which can be very challenging. Tim talked about traumatic events and how difficult they can be. We also want to build children's confidence and their competence so they know what to do and they feel confident that they can do it in helping with preparations. And then we're also hoping to build in children an appropriate sense of control. In a storm, there is so much that we cannot control, but we want to help children and teens identify the things that they can control and help them to help make those decisions. Next slide, please. Part of the reason that we know that this preparation is important for children as well as adults is because of the research on stress in the brain. Anytime we are under a stressful situation, and again, dealing with a tropical storm or a hurricane is a very stressful situation, we have a short-term stress response, which involves a massive release of cortisol in the brain, which sets us up to respond appropriately with a focus on survival. So we either fight, we flee, or we freeze. Those are the most common kinds of survival responses. Now, we may literally fight in a situation where fighting is important, or we may fight in a hurricane in the sense of pushing ourselves through to cope with the stresses and to cope with what needs to be coped with. We worry for children especially, though, about the long-term dangers of being under this stress. So we know that children who are under stress long-term tend to show things like a dominance of survival instincts, a persistent hyperarousal, meaning that they are always on high alert, they're always ready to respond. And the problem with that is it makes impulse control difficult, and it makes some of the more important higher order kinds of thinking much more difficult. So children who have been under stress long-term will have difficulty with decision making, with reasoning, with learning at school, with relationships. And so we know that having loving, consistent relationships with adults helps reduce stress. So as adults, as we model and support children in coping with this stress, we help them to build that competence and to reduce some of these long-term negatives. Next slide, please. So why do children respond differently to hurricanes and to other emergencies? Some of the things we know developmentally, especially about younger children, they have difficulty separating reality from fantasy. So what they imagine is going on and what's actually going on may be very different, but they have a hard time knowing the difference. Younger children especially have an inability to recognize danger. That's part of the reason that they often have to be supervised so carefully. Helping them to recognize what is dangerous, picking up a downed power line, for example, is important. They have limited experience in general, and certainly with something like a hurricane, and they have more limited coping skills because they have not had the opportunity to develop them yet. They rely on attachment figures for comfort and stability. So as we're planning for children, it's always important to keep in mind who are the adults that are important to that child, their parents, their grandparents, a nanny or other caregiver, and to make sure those people are present for those children as much as possible. We know that children have variations in their language ability, and especially younger children don't have the language skills to express their feelings, to express their fears, to ask questions, and those kinds of things. And probably most importantly, we know that young children especially, but even adolescents, need routines for structure and comfort. And a hurricane is going to disrupt a family's day-to-day routines in some very significant ways. So helping build that structure is going to be very important for children. So some basic strategies for preparing children for a hurricane. Explaining to children what a hurricane is, what's going to happen, what to expect in simple age-appropriate language is important. The younger the child is, the simpler it needs to be. That doesn't mean you don't explain. It doesn't mean to make things up that aren't actually helpful. But the younger a child is in general, the less information you need to start with. And then if the child asks questions, you can add on additional information. Give the children specific tasks to help prepare. It may be something as simple as identifying clothes or stuffed animals or something else like that that they want to bring with them in the case of an evacuation. This gives them some control over the situation. It helps them to feel competent. It helps them to feel like they're contributing. Explain the whys. We may not be able to explain why a hurricane is happening, but certainly explaining why are we evacuating? Why are we boarding up the windows? Why are we turning off the power? Those kinds of things may be important things for children to understand. Always emphasize that the biggest goal is to keep everybody in the family safe. As much as possible, reassure children that you will be there with them. Do this, of course, only if you will actually be there with them. Don't provide empty or false reassurances. But parents especially should reassure children, I'll be here with you. We're going to go through this together. And be aware that different children will respond differently. This sometimes has things to do with age, but it also has to do with individual personalities. So for some children, be prepared for repeated questions. And especially for younger children, you may hear the same questions over and over again. You may feel like I've already answered this. But children process things in bits and pieces. And so they may have processed one piece of what you told them the first time they asked the question, but they may have more that they still don't understand, so they may ask it again. You can give them the same information and they may process a different piece of it the next time. But also don't be surprised if children don't want to talk about their feelings. Some children don't deal with emotions and stress and trauma through talking. They have other ways to cope. And so some of these kinds of suggestions are good ways to think about helping children recover. First and foremost, and this isn't actually on this list, remember that structure and routine matters. During the storm and during the recovery after the storm, try to make children's and teens' routines as normal as possible. That may not look like what their everyday routine looks like. We've certainly experienced that during COVID. But but set up a routine that is the same as much as possible from day to day, and continue that as you're going through recovery. Keep in mind that the recovery time and process depends on children's experiences. So if a child has been at home with you riding out a storm and has experienced massive winds and rain and noise and all those kinds of things, they will have different experiences and different things to process than if they have had to quickly evacuate, if they've been stuck in a massive traffic jam because they evacuated. All of those things are things they may need to process. It's okay to share stories as appropriate. It's okay for adults to model that. And it's certainly okay for children to talk about what did they experience? What was it like? That's a step in helping them to process. Again, expect repeated questions. Expect children to return to talking about the storm. They may talk about it briefly, and then they may return to it a month or 2 months or 3 months later. As they grow and as they develop, some of these big events take on different developmental meaning. And so they may want to go back and talk about it a year or 5 or 10 years later even. And then providing ways for children to express their feelings is very important. And these pictures on the right-hand side give a couple of examples. Some of the common ways that children can express feelings in addition to talking about them include art, painting, drawing, finger painting, working with Play-Doh. All of those kinds of things can help them to express those feelings. Physical activity, moving your body physically helps to relieve some stress. And so providing appropriate ways for children to be physically active. During a storm or during an evacuation, this may have to be indoors. Once it's safe to be outdoors, having physical activity outdoors is helpful. And then providing other ways to express themselves through music, through dance, through movement, through pretend play. The ambulance here reminds us sometimes children play out their stress by acting it out. So they may pretend to be the emergency responder. They may pretend to be their parent. They may pretend to be other family members experiencing the storm. This is all a way to process. Reading books about children who have dealt with stressful situation, reading them together if appropriate. And then there are all sorts of simple stress relieving activities. The stress ball on the bottom right reminds you that something as simple as having something to squeeze can reduce that acute stress. And if you don't have a stress ball at home, you can make one with a balloon or a glove filled with rice or flour or Play-Doh, any of those kinds of things. You tie it shut and it's got a good texture to be able to squeeze and reduce stress. And then it's always important to keep track of when children don't seem to be recovering. If they're dwelling on this experience for many weeks or months afterward, if they seem to not be able to get back to other activities, school or play or spending time with friends, those kinds of things. If they're expressing a lot of stress, grief, anxiety, depression, all of those are probably indicators that they need some professional help and support. So continue to provide them with support, but also find a professional, a therapist, a licensed professional counselor, a school psychologist, somebody like that, that can also help them to process their feelings. So there's some contact information here. This is a quick overview of how to help children cope, but I am happy to talk more. Like Tim, email is the very best way to reach me, and I'm happy to talk more with you. And at this point, I will turn it back over to Maria, who's going to moderate our Q&A.
Thank you, Diane and Tim and Pam. We appreciate y'all sharing some tips with us on how we can all do a better job thinking through what we need to do to be prepared. So with that, we'll turn it over and see if any of our attendees have questions for our panelists. don't see any yet, so while we're waiting on some to come in, I'll put a few together. I think the first one's for Pam. I have heard that 2020 should be a very active storm year. Can you tell us why forecasters are saying that, and maybe how they're predicting that for us?
Sure. There's several ways that they predict the number of storms. Of course, we don't know where those storms are going to go, or even if they're going to make landfall. One is that we're in a period where sea surface temperatures are very warm. And sea surface temperatures are basically the energy that causes the storms to form and grow. So when you have really warm sea surface temperatures, the storms are more likely to develop. If you've got these waves coming off, some are stronger and some are weaker. But if you give them fuel, they're going to grow more rapidly. And this is certainly a year when sea surface temperatures are warmer than average. And actually, the trend has been towards warmer temperatures over time. Part of the reason Hurricane Michael developed just before it came on shore was that there was a lot of really warm water in the Gulf of Mexico. And so that really helped to spin up the storm just before it came on shore. The other thing that we really look for the most is the presence of strong jet streams aloft. And that's related to having an El Nino or a La Nina. Typically when we have an El Nino, which is warm water in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, we have a strong jet stream, and that really knocks the top off of storms before they can develop. This year, we're in neutral conditions headed for a La Nina, which means that the upper level winds are very weak, which means any kind of development that comes through is going to have a better chance of growing into a storm. So those are the two main things. There are a number of other factors that also go into that, but I think those are the ones that are probably the easiest to figure out.
Excellent. Thank you, Pam.
Sure.
We do have a question from Winnie Garrett that has come in on the chat. Does anyone, Tim, I'm going to bat this one to you. Question is, does anyone know when a training for emergency management for employees might be offered? And do we have to go through our local Red Cross?
Yeah, I don't know of anything that we have at UGA on the books for that. Your local emergency management does a number of trainings. We do have a youth program, a 4-H program called MyPI, and that is one that does some of the, there's a number of parts of that. The CERT program that's out there is really good. And again, that's kind of like a Master Gardener version for responding to emergencies. And that's usually offered through your local emergency management. And every county has one of those. So you can look up who that is. It can be, some counties like,
Can you tell us what CERT?
Yeah, you would say that.
I should know.
I think it's a Certified Emergency Response, something like that, I think. I can't remember.
Awesome.
Can I add something quickly, Maria?
Yes.
Pamela Turner and I are also working on a self-paced online module for childcare programs specifically about preparing for emergencies, and that should be available in the next couple of months. We've got some good county extension agents helping us with that.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Stan, for giving us the acronym. CERT stands for Community Emergency Response Team. We also didn't mention this earlier, but I had a chance to work with Tim and Pam and Carrie Hobbs and several other faculty on a proposal recently that we submitted to the National Science Foundation that if it gets funded, we would be focused on putting together some training for youth in the community and people who work with youth, and really trying to engage the local community with what they need when it comes to really preparing for hurricanes and natural disasters. So hopefully we'll hear back from that before too long. So we're excited about that. Next question from Lola. How much gasoline should be kept on hand for a small generator during storms? Who would like to take that? Either Tim or Pam?
I'll take a stab at it. It's kind of a delicate balance, because if you get too much, it goes bad and doesn't stay good for very long. But generally, I like to have as much as I can get. Because you just don't know how long it's going to be and how long you're going to run that generator. I usually, when a storm's coming through, I'll gas up my generator, and I'll probably have 2 gas cans with about 5 gallons in each gas can at least. Because again, usually the gas stations are empty 3 or 4 days before the storm hits. and it's going to be a week or 2 weeks before you can find gas locally again. So, you know, you got to think about
10 gallons.
I'd say that's kind of your minimum. You know, you have to remember, I'm talking about evacuating my family, and I may not even be home. So, you know, if you're running that thing, and I'll do it where I'll run it for a little bit, get everything cold in the freezer, and I shut it off. And I don't cook on the stove. I cook outside on a grill. So I'm using charcoal or non-electric things to do that. So, you know, generator is really kind of like emergency backup. And so, you know, try not to run it any more than I absolutely have to. So, you know, I'd say 10 gallons is probably your minimum, and go up from there.
The next question I have is for Diane. You mentioned earlier that having specific jobs for children to do to help prepare for an evacuation. Can you give us some examples of things that would be appropriate for children to assist with?
Sure. And of course, it depends on the age of the child. Younger children, it really may be simple things like collecting their favorite blanket or their favorite stuffed animal to take with them. School-age children may be able to help with things like collecting the supplies you need for your pets if you're going to evacuate, or helping make sure that anything that's loose in your yard is inside or tacked down. Older children may be able to do things like supervise younger siblings if need be, as well as help with some of the adult jobs with careful supervision.
Great.
I think I'd like to add to that. I think older kids can be a real help in the planning process too. They can brainstorm where in the house is a safe place to go. If they like maps, you know, where would be places that we could go to evacuate? Because I think that gives them control over the situation. And so they're much more likely to be involved in a positive way in the process if you can get them involved in that from the start. Same thing would be true if you're planning fire drills for your family. You know, the more control you can give them, the better. I got interested in the weather because a tornado came 2 blocks from my house when I was in the 3rd grade. I got really interested in that, and you know, education through 4-H or other ways is a great way to train kids to think about it ahead of time. Again, this is especially for the older kids. But to involve them in the process from start to finish, and they might remember things that you don't, because you know, kids are good at that, and so that's an important thing to remember too.
And you'll certainly build the skills then to know how to cope when they're adults and have their own homes and their own families.
That's right.
I think the other thing too is practicing it. You know, I've done it. My boys are grown now, but when they were little, you know, we would practice this. I'd get them up in the middle of the night and pretend there was a storm and they had to, you know, go to the right place at the right time. Or I used to take them out hunting, and we were going to come home that night, and I'd tell them, get prepared, we're going to go hunting. And we come, you know, I'd get there and say, well, the car won't start, you got to spend the night, and see how they handle that. And that practice, when you end up in the real situation, if you've practiced it in real terms, makes it really easy if practice is like the real thing, it doesn't feel any different.
And the same thing's true with all kinds of emergencies, evacuating for a fire and things like that as well.
All right, well, thank you. We did have a question earlier. Someone asked for the link for the youth training, and Tony Hoolan provided that for us. It's www.mypigeorgia.org. And one final question, where's the best place to store gas for emergencies? Coming in from Lola.
All right, well, the best place to store it, well, first off, you need to use certified containers, you know, so you're not using, you know, that leftover 2.5 gallon Roundup jug. You're using something certified for gasoline. You have it properly sealed, and I would keep it as far away from my living area as I can. You know, so usually in my house, that's someplace in the garage. It's usually near the exit door to the garage, and I try to keep other things away from it, so it's kind of like isolated all by itself. But the main thing is, you know, if you have those certified containers, that's going to be much safer, and have them properly sealed and maintained. You know, if they get old or whatever, have them replaced. They're not really that expensive. I will tell you, they get more expensive the closer you get to an actual storm.
And you probably need to replace it every year and not let it sit there for 5 years.
Yeah. Gasoline's pretty strong solvent, so you want to replace that on a regular basis.
Well, thank you guys. Great job. We enjoyed learning with you and hearing more about what we can do to be prepared. Our next webinar is scheduled for 2 weeks from today on August the 27th at 10:30. And we plan to talk about back to school transitions for families, children, and teachers. So that should be a good topic. All right. Thank you so much.